Asterisk, asterisk. Part 1. The cold wind on the high plains. Asterisk, asterisk. The wind in Montana in the winter of '78 wasn't just cold, it was a thief. It stole the warmth from a man's bones, the breath from his lungs, and the hope from his heart if he let it. It howled down from the jagged peaks of the Beartooths, a mournful, hungry sound that scoured the high plains bare, leaving behind nothing but a hard, glittering crust of snow and the skeletons of last year's sagebrush. The town of Clearwater Gap was little more than a smudge against the vast, white emptiness. A handful of squat, timber buildings clinging to life. 2 saloons whose windows glowed a sullen yellow even in the afternoon gloom. A general store with its porch sagging under the weight of the snow. And a church whose steeple leaned as if in perpetual prayer for a spring that seemed a lifetime away. From the edge of this sorry settlement, a single road, churned into a frozen rut by wagon wheels and hooves, snaked its way west toward the dark, imposing silhouette of the Stone Valley Ranch. It was along this road that Evelyn Carter walked, a solitary figure in a landscape that tolerated no weakness. She was 19, though the hardship etched around her eyes and the grim set of her mouth could have added a decade to her age. Her shawl, a threadbare inheritance from a mother she barely remembered, was a poor defense against the wind's relentless assault. With every gust, it tried to rip the fabric from her shoulders, forcing her to clutch it tight at her throat with a hand raw and red from the cold, beneath her thin dress, her worn-out boots, patched with twine and hope, soaked through with melting snow, turning her feet into numb blocks of ice. She had been walking for 3 days, ever since she'd left Billings with little more than the clothes on her back and a reputation she hadn't earned but couldn't escape. In a town where a woman's worth was measured by her father's name or her husband's fortune, an orphan with nothing but her pride was an easy target for whispers. The whispers had grown into accusations. The accusations into a suffocating certainty in the eyes of the townfolk that she was no better than she ought to be. So she had left. She had chosen the unforgiving wilderness over the slow, poisonous death of public scorn. Now, survival was a simpler, more brutal calculus. It was measured in steps. Each one was a small war fought against the screaming wind and the screaming emptiness in her belly. She hadn't eaten in a day, save for a heel of stale bread she'd gnawed on that morning, and her vision had begun to swim at the edges, but in her eyes, the color of new moss in a spring forest. There was a fire that the cold hadn't touched. It was the hard, defiant glint of a soul that had been bent but refused to break. The Stone Valley Ranch was not a place of welcome. It was a fortress of timber and stone, built to withstand the harshness of the land and the men who worked it. A long, low bunkhouse, a massive barn, and a sprawling main house stood like grim sentinels around a vast, snow-covered yard. Smoke plumed from a dozen chimneys, the only sign of warmth in the entire frozen valley. It was that smoke, the promise of a fire, that had pulled her forward for the last 5 miles. As she stumbled into the main yard, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the main house's porch. He was tall, broader than any man she'd ever seen up close, and he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of innate power. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat over dark trousers, and his hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. He didn't move toward her, just stood there, watching her approach, his stillness a challenge. This had to be him, Jesse Stone. The name was spoken with a mix of fear and respect back in Clearwater Gap. The man who ran the valley. Eve's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of ice. This was her last chance. If he turned her away, the wind and the snow would have her before morning. She straightened her shoulders, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of defiance, and forced her frozen legs to carry her the last few yards until she stood before him. She stopped a respectful distance away, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Jesse Stone's eyes, When he finally lifted his head enough for her to see them, were the color of a winter sky before a storm. A cold, hard gray that seemed to see right through her thin shawl and into the desperate heart of her. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with lines of command etched around his eyes and a mouth set in a permanent, unyielding line. He looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive inventory that took in her ragged boots, her cheap dress, and the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. His gaze was heavy, accustomed to weighing men and cattle and finding them wanting. "You're lost," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together. Eve's chin lifted. She would not beg. She had promised herself that. "No, sir," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady despite the shivering that racked her body. "I'm looking for work." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or amusement crossed his face before it was gone. "This is a cattle ranch, girl, not a finishing school. There's no work for your kind here." His meaning was clear. Asterisk frail. Female. Useless. The insult was a spark against the dry tinder of her pride. "My kind can work as hard as any man when given the chance," she said, her green eyes flashing. "I can cook. I can clean. I can mend. I'm not afraid of calluses on my hands." He studied her for another long moment, his gaze unblinking. He was a man used to lies and false fronts, to desperate people telling him whatever they thought he wanted to hear. But there was something in her directness, in the raw honesty of her desperation, that was different. She wasn't pleading. She was offering a bargain. Her labor for a roof and a meal? "Cook," he repeated, the word laced with skepticism. "The last cook we had was a one-eyed mule skinner who got drunk and tried to serve the boys boiled leather for supper. They ran him off before I had the chance. You think you can handle 25 hungry cowboys?" "I think 25 hungry cowboys would be grateful for a hot meal, no matter who cooked it," she retorted, a hint of sharpness in her tone. "Give me one day, one meal. If they don't like my cooking, I'll be on my way come morning. You'll have lost nothing but a handful of flour and some salt pork." It was a bold gamble, and she knew it, but she had nothing left to lose. She met his gaze without flinching, her small frame braced against the wind, a lonely pillar of defiance in the vast, indifferent landscape. For the first time, Jesse Stone seemed to see more than just a ragged, half-frozen girl. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the unyielding fire in her eyes. It was a look he had seen before, in the eyes of wild mustangs just before they were broken, a fierce spirit that refused to be tamed. He had a deep, grudging respect for that spirit, whether in a horse or a human. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The cookhouse is behind the main house. There's a small room off the back for the cook. It's yours for the night." He turned to walk away, then paused. "The bunkhouse eats at dawn. Don't be late." And with that, he was gone, disappearing back into the warmth and shadows of the main house, leaving Eve alone in the biting wind. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over her, making her knees weak. She had done it. She had a roof over her head for the night. A chance. She drew in a ragged breath of icy air, the cold searing her lungs, and made her way toward the cookhouse. Her steps, for the first time in days, feeling less like a retreat and more like a march. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The cookhouse was a world unto itself, a long, cavernous room dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that stood in the center like a black, malevolent god. The air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, stale grease, wood smoke, and the faint, sour smell of spilled whiskey. It was dirty and neglected, but to Eve, it was a sanctuary. And the small room off the back, with its narrow cot and single grimy window, was a palace. She worked through the evening and into the night with a frantic, focused energy. She scrubbed the long trestle tables until the wood gleamed, scoured the blackened pots until she could see her own weary reflection in them, and took a careful inventory of the pantry, The supplies were basic sacks of flour, beans, potatoes, slabs of salt pork, coffee, and little else, but to her, they were a treasure. They were the tools of her salvation. As the ranch settled into a deep, snow-muffled silence, Eve finally allowed herself a moment's rest. She sat on a stool before the great stove, which now purred with a steady, comforting heat, and peeled off her ruined boots. Her feet were a mess of blisters and raw, chafed skin. She soaked them in a basin of hot water, the stinging pain a welcome sign that they were still hers, still feeling. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was warm, she was safe. And as she stared into the mesmerizing dance of the flames through the stove's grate, a single, hot tear traced the path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of profound, bone-deep relief. She must have dozed off, lulled by the warmth and the low hum of the fire. She was startled awake by the soft creak of the door. Her head snapped up, her body instantly tense, every nerve on high alert. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the doorway. It was Jesse Stone. He moved into the room with the quiet grace of a predator, his big frame seeming to shrink the cavernous space. He hadn't come for an inspection. He was heading toward a small cabinet on the far wall where she'd seen a few bottles of whiskey stored. He hadn't seemed to notice her, huddled in the dark by the stove. Eve's heart leaped into her throat. She was alone. The rest of the ranch was asleep. She was a lone woman in an isolated room with a man whose power was absolute here. All the stories she'd heard, all the fears she'd run from, coalesced into a single, terrifying knot in her stomach. She made a small, involuntary movement, and he stopped. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes piercing the gloom. For a moment, he simply stared, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice low and rough, stripping the air of its warmth. Fear was a cold hand gripping her heart, but pride was a fire in her veins. She would not cower. She would not show him she was afraid. She slowly, deliberately, rose to her feet. Putting the stool between them, she was painfully aware of her bare feet on the rough floorboards, of her simple, worn dress. "My duties, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They don't end when the sun goes down. There's bread to be set for the morning." He took a step closer, and another. The space between them shrank until he was only an arm's length away. The heat from the stove was on her back, the heat of his body before her. She could smell the faint, clean scent of snow on his coat, and beneath it, the sharp, dark aroma of whiskey. He was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him, and she felt a tremor of pure, primal fear. But she held his gaze. She met that storm-gray stare with her own moss-green one, and she did not look away. Jesse looked down at her, at this slip of a girl who stood before him with the defiance of a cornered cat. He was used to women who looked at him with calculation, with avarice, or with a simpering deference designed to win his favor. He was used to the women in the saloons who offered a practiced smile for a price, and the daughters of wealthy men whose fathers pushed them toward him, their eyes full of ambition. He had never been looked at like this. He saw the fear in her eyes, yes, a flicker deep within their green depths, but it was banked by a fierce, stubborn pride. Her chin was lifted. Her small body was taut with tension, but she was not bowing. She was not breaking. In the flickering firelight, her eyes seemed to throw off sparks of their own, a fire that matched the one in the stove. For the first time since his mother had died, a lifetime ago, Jesse Stone looked at a woman and felt something other than contempt or a cold, calculated desire. He felt intrigued. He saw a strength in her that belied her fragile appearance, a core of tempered steel forged in a fire he could only guess at. He, who commanded an army of men and a kingdom of land, who could break any man or horse that defied him, found himself held captive by the unwavering gaze of a 19-year-old girl with nothing to her name but a pair of torn boots and an unbreakable will. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart, or perhaps it was his own. He reached out, not to touch her, but to the cabinet just past her shoulder, his arm brushing against her sleeve. She flinched, but didn't pull away. He retrieved a bottle of whiskey and a glass, his movements slow, deliberate. He poured a drink, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the door, the bottle in his hand. He paused in the doorway, his back to her. "See that you earn your keep, girl," he said, his voice a low growl that held a new, unreadable note. Then he was gone, melting back into the night, leaving Eve trembling in the sudden silence, her heart pounding a wild rhythm against her ribs. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with something else now, a strange, exhilarating sense of victory. She hadn't flinched, she hadn't broken, and in the eyes of the master of Stone Valley, she had seen not the look of a predator sizing up its prey, but the startled recognition of an equal. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 2. The Hearth Fire and the Watchful Eyes, asterisk, asterisk. Dawn broke over Stone Valley not with a gentle blush, but with a hard, gray light that offered no warmth, only visibility. Inside the cookhouse, however, warmth was a living thing. Eve had been up for hours, a whirlwind of quiet, purposeful motion. The great iron stove, her silent ally, was roaring, its heat pushing back the morning's chill. The air, once stale with neglect, was now thick with the soul-stirring aromas of baking bread, frying bacon, and coffee so strong it could raise the dead. The first cowboys trickled in like bears roused from hibernation big eagle, shuffling men with sleep-crusted eyes and the sour tempers of the perpetually cold and overworked. They stopped dead in the doorway, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. The long tables were scrubbed clean, the floor was swept, and standing by the stove, a smudge of flour on her cheek and her green eyes focused intently on a bubbling pot of gravy, was the half-frozen girl from the day before. A low whistle cut through the silence. "Well, I'll be—" a lanky cowboy named Dusty muttered, nudging his companion. A grizzled man with a face like a weathered boot. Looks like the boss found himself a stray kitten. A ripple of coarse laughter followed. They took their seats, their movements loud and deliberately clumsy. The scraping of benches and clatter of tin plates a kind of challenge. They were a pack, testing a new member, and their currency was mockery. "Hey, girlie," called a barrel-chested man with a thick red beard. "You know how to make anything besides burned water. Old One-Eye's coffee could strip paint." Eve didn't turn around. She finished stirring the gravy, her movements smooth and economical, then carried the heavy pot to the serving line she'd set up on a side counter. Beside it were platters piled high with sourdough biscuits, golden brown and fluffy, a mountain of crisp, perfectly rendered salt pork, and a pot of beans, slow simmered with molasses and a hint of spice. She filled the enormous coffee pot and set it on the table. Only then did she turn to face them, her expression unreadable. "It's ready," she said, her voice clear and carrying easily over their grumbling. "Eat or don't. Makes no difference to me. Your boss is paying for the food either way." Her complete lack of deference stunned them into a momentary silence. They had expected fear, or a nervous titter, or a desperate attempt to please. They had not expected this cool indifference. Grumbling. They shuffled to the line and began to fill their plates, their portions heaping, as if daring the food to be as bad as they expected. Then they began to eat. A profound quiet descended upon the cookhouse, a silence more eloquent than any compliment. The only sounds were the scrape of forks against tin, the soft sigh of a man savoring a mouthful of biscuit and gravy, the deep gulps of hot, black coffee. This was not the boiled leather of their former cook. The biscuits were light, with a tender crumb that soaked up the rich, savory gravy. The salt pork was fried to a perfect balance of crisp and chew. The beans were a revelation of smoky sweetness. It was simple, honest food, but it was cooked with a care and attention none of them had tasted in years. If ever, it tasted of a hearth, of a home, of a world far removed from this frozen, womanless frontier. The red-bearded man, the one who'd heckled her, caught her eye as he went back for a third biscuit. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. He cleared his throat. "Ain't half bad, Miss," he grunted, a high compliment from a man like him. Eve simply nodded, a small, tight gesture, and turned back to her work. Beginning the monumental task of washing the pots and pans, she had won the first battle. Her hands were her weapons, the stove her fortress, and the meal her declaration of worth. From his customary table in the corner, Jesse Stone watched the entire scene unfold. He had entered quietly, taking his seat without fanfare. An observer in his own kingdom, he saw the men's initial derision, their surprise, and their eventual grudging capitulation. But his attention was not on them. It was on Eve. He watched the way she moved. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. She commanded the chaotic space of the kitchen with an authority that was as natural as breathing. She was small, almost childlike in her worn dress. Yet she handled the heavy cast-iron skillets with an easy strength. He saw the intelligence in her hands as she kneaded dough, the focus in her eyes as she tasted a sauce. She wasn't just cooking. She was creating order. She was taming the wildness of this place, starting with its heart, the cookhouse. He remembered the previous night, the fear and defiance warring in her green eyes. Now, in her element, the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet competence that was even more compelling. She was not a stray kitten. She was a hawk, sharp-eyed and self-possessed, who had found a temporary perch, and he found, to his own surprise, that he wanted her to stay. The truce, however, was a fragile one. As the days turned into a week, and Eve's meals became the undisputed highlight of life at Stone Valley, the men's initial respect began to curdle into a different kind of curiosity. A woman like her didn't just appear out of a snowstorm. She had to have come from somewhere, and in their world, a lone woman's past was always a subject for speculation. The whispers started in the bunkhouse after the lights were out, and seeped into the barn during the day. They were led by men like Dusty, who had a mean-spirited streak and a resentment for anything that disrupted the ranch's rough equilibrium. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" he'd say to a receptive audience, leaning on a pitchfork. "But where'd a girl learn to cook like that? Not from her mother, I'd wager. Heard she came from Billings." The name of the town was loaded. Billings was a railroad hub, a place where civilization and savagery met, full of saloons, gambling dens, and houses where a woman's company could be bought for a price. "I heard there was a girl looked just like her at the Rose Bell," another man would add, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Green eyes, proud way of walking. Heard she was popular with the railroad men. The rumors were poison, spreading quietly and infecting the atmosphere of the cookhouse. The men's looks began to change. The gruff respect was replaced by a sly, knowing appraisal. Their jokes became more pointed, their requests for an extra piece of pie laced with a suggestive familiarity. They were trying to put her in a box they understood, to file her away under a label that made sense to them: fallen woman, whore, a commodity. It was easier than accepting she was simply a good cook who had fallen on hard times. Eve heard the whispers. She saw the change in their eyes. She would be serving stew, and a cowboy would thank her with a look that stripped her bare. Each insinuation was a small, sharp sting. It was the same poison she had fled in her hometown, and the bitterness of it rose in her throat. She had thought, foolishly, that out here, in this vast, empty land, a person's work was all that mattered. She was learning that a woman's past, real or imagined, was a chain she could never outrun. But she did not confront them. She did not cry. To do so would be to show weakness, to give them a victory. Instead, she retreated further into herself. Her face became a stoic mask, her movements even more precise. She answered their thinly veiled insults with a clipped, "Yes, sir," or "No, sir," and turned away, her back a rigid wall of defiance. She scrubbed the tables with a ferocity that left her knuckles raw, pouring all her fear and rage into the work until she was too exhausted to feel anything at all. Jesse saw it all. He heard the whispers, too, and a cold, unfamiliar anger coiled in his gut. It was a protective instinct, fierce and primal, that startled him. His first impulse was to stride into the bunkhouse, drag Dusty out by the scruff of his neck, and beat the truth into him before the entire crew. He had the power to do it. One word from him would silence the rumors forever. But he held back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew his men. If he, the powerful, aloof owner, suddenly became her champion, it would be the worst thing he could do for her. It would elevate her to the status of his personal property in their eyes. The whispers would not stop. They would just change, becoming more venomous. She would no longer be the Rosebell girl. She would be the boss's girl, a position that came with its own kind of prison. She would become a source of jealousy and resentment, isolated from everyone, dependent solely on his protection. It would turn her into a plaything, a pawn in the games of men, the very thing he sensed she was fighting so hard not to be. He was 32 years old. He had wealth, power, and a past of his own that kept him walled off from any real connection. She was 19, innocent despite the rumors, and as vulnerable as a single blade of grass in a blizzard. The chasm between them was too vast. To cross it, to claim her in any way, felt like an act of profound selfishness, an exercise of power that could crush her. So he watched, and he waited, and he hated himself for it. He kept his distance, his face an unreadable mask of cold authority, but his eyes followed her constantly. He saw the slight tremor in her hands when a cowboy leaned too close, the tightening of her jaw when she overheard a cruel remark, and his admiration for her grew into something deeper, something more dangerous. He saw her fighting her own war, silently and with immense courage, and he was drawn to that fire in a way he had not been drawn to anything in a very long time. The kitchen stove became the symbol of their unspoken conflict. For Eve, its constant roaring fire was a reflection of her own will to survive. It was the heart of her small kingdom, a source of life-giving warmth she could control. As she fed it wood, she was feeding her own defiance. As she banked its coals at night, she was preserving her own strength for the next day's battle. The fire was life. It was power. For Jesse, that same fire was a beacon in the cold emptiness of his own existence. He would often find excuses to be in the main house's study, which overlooked the cookhouse. Long after the ranch was asleep, he would watch the single golden square of her window, knowing she was in there, safe for the moment by the warm glow of the banked embers. The image of her, standing resolute in the firelight, was the first thing to have touched the frozen part of his heart where the memory of his mother lay buried. The stove's warmth was a promise of something he had long ago given up on the possibility of a home. And he knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that the keeper of that flame was the young woman who was fighting for her soul in the heart of his ranch. Part 3. Old Wounds ****. The fragile peace of the cookhouse could not last. It was a temporary dam holding back a river of suspicion and malice, and a man like Red Callahan was destined to break it. Callahan was one of the oldest hands at Stone Valley, a man whose loyalty to the ranch was unquestioned, but whose soul had long since shriveled from bitterness and a deep-seated contempt for anyone he deemed weaker than himself. He had been a top rider in his day, but age and a thrown horse had left him with a permanent limp and a job mending tack in the barn, a position he viewed as a profound indignity. He watched Eve's quiet rise in the ranch's hierarchy with a resentful, narrowed gaze. In her, he saw not a survivor, but an upstart who had somehow charmed the boss and usurped the natural, male order of things. The tension finally snapped on a bitter Tuesday evening. A new storm was brewing in the mountains, and the air in the cookhouse was heavy and close, charged with an unspoken static. The men ate with their heads bent low over their plates, the scrape and clatter of cutlery unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Eve moved between the tables, refilling coffee cups, her senses on high alert. She could feel Callahan's eyes on her, a hot, unpleasant weight on her back. She was clearing the plates from his end of the table when he spoke, his voice a low, carrying drawl that sliced through the room's quiet. "Food's mighty fine tonight. Missy," he began, leaning back on his bench and picking his teeth with a sliver of wood. "Reminds me of a place I used to know back in Billings. The Rose Bell. They had a girl there who could cook, too, amongst other things." The room went dead silent. Every man froze, fork halfway to his mouth. This was it. The rumor was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a living, breathing thing in the center of the room. Eve's back was to him, her hands full of dirty plates. For a heartbeat, her entire body went rigid. She felt a wave of cold nausea, the familiar, sickening lurch of public shame. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back to the safety of her kitchen, back to the anonymity of the road. But then, she thought of the days of walking, of the gnawing hunger and the soul-crushing cold. She thought of the small cot that was the first bed she'd ever truly called her own. She would not give it up. She would not let this bitter, broken man drive her back into the wilderness. Slowly, deliberately, she set the plates down on the table. She turned to face him, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. Her face was pale, but her moss-green eyes were clear and steady, holding his watery, blue-eyed gaze without a flicker. Callahan smirked, sensing a victory. "Yeah, the Rose Bell," he continued, enjoying his audience. "This girl there, she had green eyes, just like yours, a proud way about her. Too, real popular. She was, I reckon a man could get lonely out here. A man who knows how to keep a secret could be a good friend to have." The implication was as ugly and obvious as the leer on his face. He was offering her a choice, his silence in exchange for her submission. He was trying to put a price on her, right here, in front of everyone. Eve's voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and laced with such cold contempt that it seemed to suck all the air from the room. "Decent women," she said, her eyes sweeping over not just Callahan, but every man at the table, forcing them to meet her gaze. Do whatever they must to survive. It was not a confession. It was not a denial. It was a judgment. It was a mirror held up to their own hard lives, to the compromises and harsh necessities of survival on the frontier. It was a truth so stark and unadorned that it shamed them. The men shifted on their benches, their gazes falling to their plates. They were all survivors. They had all done things they were not proud of to see another sunrise. Her words struck a chord of recognition, and in that moment, Callahan's accusation lost its power, turning from a specific slander into a general, uncomfortable truth. But Callahan was too far gone in his own cruelty to back down. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. "You hear that, boys? She ain't even denying it, a common—" He never finished the word. A shadow fell over the table. Jesse Stone had risen from his corner seat. He had moved with a speed and silence that was terrifying in a man his size. One moment he was at his table. The next he was standing behind Callahan. "Get up, Red," Jesse said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. Callahan, startled, twisted around on the bench. "Now, boss, I said, get up." Reluctantly. Callahan pushed himself to his feet. He was a big man himself, but he was dwarfed by Jesse's sheer height and the cold, controlled fury radiating from him. Before Callahan could open his mouth again, Jesse's right hand shot out, not in a wild brawler's swing, but in a short, precise, brutal jab that landed squarely on Callahan's jaw. The sound was like a dry branch snapping. Callahan's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up in their sockets. He staggered backward, tripped over the bench, and crashed to the floor in a heap, out cold before he landed. The cookhouse was utterly still. No one breathed. No one moved. The only sound was the hiss and crackle of the fire in the great stove. Jesse stood over the unconscious man, his chest rising and falling, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. He looked down at Callahan for a long moment, his expression one of pure, glacial contempt. Then he slowly raised his head, and his storm-gray eyes swept across the faces of his men. They were a mask of cold, absolute authority. "This woman," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a shard of ice, "is the cook for this ranch. She works for me. She is under my protection. If I hear one more whisper, one more joke, if any man so much as looks at her the wrong way again, I will not fire him. I will break his hands and throw him out into the snow to die. Is that understood?" A ragged chorus of "Yes, sir," filled the room. The men couldn't look at him. They couldn't look at Eve. They stared at the floor, at the walls, at the still form of Red Callahan. The power dynamic of the entire ranch had just been violently and irrevocably rewritten. Jesse's gaze finally came to rest on Eve. For a fraction of a second, the icy fury in his eyes softened, replaced by something fierce, protective, and deeply personal. It was a look that claimed her, that bound her to him in front of all of them. Then the mask of command slammed back down. He pointed to two of the younger cowboys. "Get him out of here. Throw him in the barn. If he's still on my land by sunrise, you can shoot him." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the cookhouse, leaving behind a wake of terror, shock, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Later that night, Eve sat on the edge of her narrow cot, her body wrapped in a thin blanket, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with the temperature. The cookhouse was quiet. The fire banked for the night. The scene from dinner replayed in her mind over and over again Callahan's ugly sneer. The silence of the men. The sickening crack of Jesse's fist against bone. A part of her was flooded with a fierce, overwhelming gratitude. No one had ever stood up for her before. Ever. Her entire life had been a series of retreats, of enduring whispers and insults in silence because she had no one to defend her. Jesse's intervention had been a shield, a wall of strength she had never known. He had protected her. But beneath the gratitude, a cold dread was spreading through her veins. He hadn't just protected her. He had branded her, in the eyes of the crew. She was no longer Eve Carter, the cook. She was Jesse Stone's woman. She had been bought and paid for, not with coin, but with a display of brutal violence. She had traded one kind of cage for another, perhaps a more comfortable one, but a cage nonetheless. And the fear was the worst part. Callahan's accusation had come so close to a truth she guarded with every fiber of her being. She had never worked at the Rose Bell. She had never sold her body, but she had come close. She remembered a night in Billings, 2 weeks before she fled, when she hadn't eaten in 3 days. She remembered standing in the rain outside a similar establishment, the sound of laughter and piano music spilling out. Her stomach twisted into a knot of hunger and desperation. She had taken a step toward the door, her mind numb, thinking only of a hot meal and a warm bed, of doing what she must to survive. She had turned away at the last second, a core of self-worth she didn't know she possessed pulling her back from the brink. But the memory of that moment, of how close she had come, was a fresh wound. If Jesse, or any of these men, ever knew how desperate she had truly been, would they still see her as a decent woman, or would they see her as Callahan had? As something just waiting to be bought, Jessie's protection was built on a lie, on the idea of her as a wronged innocent. She feared that the real, complicated truth of her poverty was a secret that, if revealed, would cost her everything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the main house, Jesse poured himself a third glass of whiskey, his knuckles raw and aching. He stared into the fire in his study's hearth, but he didn't see the flames. He saw her face. He saw the flicker of terror in her green eyes giving way to that astonishing, unshakable resolve. Asterisk, decent women do whatever they must to survive. The words echoed in his mind. He had acted on pure, unthinking instinct. The sight of Callahan trying to corner her, to cheapen her, had ignited a rage in him so profound it had bypassed all his careful logic, all his reasons for keeping his distance. When his fist had connected with Callahan's jaw, it had been more than just a punishment. It had been a statement. Asterisk mine. Asterisk. The thought was possessive, savage, and it shook him to his core. He had spent years running this ranch, building a wall of cold authority around himself, keeping his men and the world at arm's length. It was a way to manage the crushing weight of his inheritance, the expectations of his father back east, a world of banking, politics, and arranged marriages he had fled after the war. He had come out here to escape, to play the part of a simple rancher, to avoid the responsibilities his name demanded. He thought he was strong, a master of his own destiny. But watching Eve stand up to 25 hostile men with nothing but the truth of her own hardship as a shield, he saw a strength that dwarfed his own. She wasn't running from anything. She was standing her ground, fighting for her place in the world with a courage he had never been forced to muster. He ran from a future of too much. She fought for a future with anything at all. In that moment, he realized his desire to protect her was tangled up with a desperate need to be near that strength, to draw from that fire. It was no longer a matter of duty or pity. He wanted her, not just her body, but her spirit, her fire, her unbreakable will. He wanted to be the man who deserved to stand by her side, not just as her protector, but as her equal. And that realization was a far more dangerous and complicated thing than a simple barroom brawl. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 4. The Midnight Fire and the Vow. Asterisk, asterisk. In the 3 days following the confrontation with Red Callahan, a fragile and unnatural quiet settled over Stone Valley Ranch. The men moved with a new caution, their boisterous energy replaced by a wary deference. They spoke to Eve in quiet, respectful tones, their eyes never quite meeting hers. They feared Jesse Stone's wrath, and by extension, they feared her. Eve felt the change keenly. She was no longer just the cook. She was a symbol of the boss's power, an untouchable figurehead. The isolation, in its own way, was as sharp as their earlier contempt. She had a protector, but she had lost the simple, hard-won camaraderie of the shared meal. She was safe, but she was more alone than ever. The storm that had been threatening finally broke, burying the valley under another foot of snow and bringing with it a wind of exceptional, shrieking violence. It tore at the ranch buildings, rattling windows and finding every crack in the timber walls. It was a wild, untamable night, the kind that made men huddle closer to the stove and thank God for a solid roof over their heads. Eve was in her small room, mending a tear in her only spare dress by the light of a single lantern. The main cookhouse was dark and quiet, the great stove banked for the night, its embers glowing a dull, sleepy red. She could hear the wind howling around the eaves, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the ache in her own heart. She had just finished her stitching when she smelled it, a faint, acrid scent that was not wood smoke. It was the sharp, hungry smell of burning pine. She opened her door and a wave of heat and thick, oily smoke hit her in the face. The far end of the cookhouse roof was glowing with a terrifying, orange light. Fire! The word was a strangled cry in her throat. She burst out the back door into the snow-filled night, her heart hammering against her ribs, The wind, that relentless, shrieking demon, had caught a stray ember from the chimney pipe and driven it deep into the dry timber of the roof. Now, fanned by the gale, the small spark had exploded into a conflagration. Flames were already licking up the side of the building, consuming the dry wood with a dreadful, roaring hunger. The cry was picked up by a watchman. "Fire cookhouse is on fire." The ranch exploded into chaotic life. Men, half-dressed and bleary-eyed, poured from the bunkhouse, shouting and pointing. The orange glow of the blaze painted their panicked faces in grotesque, dancing light. In moments, Jesse was there, clad only in trousers and boots, his coat thrown hastily over his shoulders. He was a pillar of command in the swirling chaos, his voice a bellow that cut through the roar of the fire and the wind. "Bucket Brigade, to the well, Dusty. You and Sam get the horses out of the north barn before the sparks catch it. Move." Men scrambled to obey, their fear channeled by the force of his will. But Eve knew, with a sinking, cold certainty, that it was hopeless. The wind was too strong, the fire too fast. She stood in the snow, her thin nightdress offering no protection against the biting cold, and watched her world burn. Everything she had built, her small sanctuary of safety and purpose, was being devoured by the flames. The pots she had scoured, the tables she had scrubbed, the very floorboards she had walked with a sense of ownership, all of it was turning to smoke and ash. Then, a thought, sharp as a knife, pierced through her shock. Asterisk, the book. It was a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a wooden box beneath her cot. It was not filled with secrets or memories, but with her mother's recipes, written in a graceful, fading hand. Biscuits and stews, remedies for coughs, instructions for preserving summer berries. It was the only thing she had of her mother's. It was the only proof that she had come from somewhere, from someone. It was the sum total of her inheritance, the foundation upon which she had built her entire identity. Before she was even aware of making a decision, her body was moving. She heard men shouting her name, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance. There was only the fire, and the book, and a desperate, primal need to save the last piece of her past. She dodged a cowboy who tried to grab her arm and ran, head down, back toward the burning building. She plunged through the doorway into a hell of smoke and roaring heat. Jesse saw her go. He was directing the brigade when he saw the flash of her white nightdress disappear into the inferno. A guttural roar of pure, animal terror was ripped from his throat. Eve. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He abandoned the bucket line, abandoned his post as commander, and sprinted after her. The men fell back, their faces aghast, as their boss charged into the heart of the blaze. Inside, the heat was a physical blow, searing his lungs with every breath. The smoke was a blinding, choking shroud. The roar of the fire was deafening, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers. "Eve," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Where are you?" He found her in her small room, which was now an oven of swirling smoke and embers. She was on her hands and knees, fumbling with the small wooden box beneath the cot, a look of wild desperation on her soot-streaked face. She had the box in her hands just as a heavy, burning beam from the ceiling crashed down, missing her by inches and showering the room with a cascade of sparks that set her cot ablaze. She screamed, a thin, terrified sound. Jesse reached her in 2 strides, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. "We have to go now." "The book," she cried, clutching the smoldering box to her chest. "To hell with the book," he roared, pulling her bodily toward the door. She stumbled, coughing and choking, her lungs on fire. He wrapped a powerful arm around her waist, half lifting, half dragging her through the churning chaos of the main room. The heat was unbearable, his hair and clothes smoking. Just as they burst back out into the freezing night air, the main roof of the cookhouse groaned. shuddered, and collapsed inward with a sound like the end of the world, sending a mushroom cloud of fire and embers billowing into the black sky. Jessie dragged her a safe distance away before they both fell to their knees in the snow, gasping, retching, and dragging the clean, cold air into their scorched lungs. The entire ranch stood frozen, watching them. The bucket brigade had stopped, their efforts forgotten. There was nothing left to save. The cookhouse was a funeral pyre, its bright, terrible light illuminating the tableau in the snow, the formidable rancher on his knees, his arms protectively around the small, trembling figure of the cook. Eve stared at the inferno, her mind a numb void of shock and loss. It was gone, all of it. Her home, her job, her purpose, her sanctuary. She had run from scorn, fought for a foothold, and now even that had been ripped away by a random act of fate. She was back where she had started with nothing, less than nothing. She looked down at the wooden box in her arms. The lid had been burned away, and the leather-bound book inside was a blackened, smoking ruin. Only a few charred pages remained. A sound, a terrible, ragged sob, broke from her lips. It was a sound of utter desolation, of a soul that had been stretched taut for too long and had finally snapped. Her strength, her pride, her fierce, stubborn will, it all dissolved in that one heartbreaking sound. The cold of the snow seeped into her thin nightdress, and she began to shake, a deep, violent tremor that shook her entire frame. "It's all gone," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She stared at the flames, but she wasn't seeing them. She was seeing the long, cold road ahead, the endless cycle of running and fighting and surviving. I can't do this again." She looked up at Jessie, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears, reflecting the fire's destructive light. In her gaze, he saw not defiance, but the terrifying, transparent fragility of a spirit at its absolute limit. "I'll break," she breathed, the words a wisp of vapor in the frigid air. It was the ultimate confession, an admission of the vulnerability she had guarded so fiercely. Jessie looked at her, at the soot on her face, at the scorched hem of her nightdress, at the utter devastation in her eyes, and in that moment, all the walls he had built around his own heart, all the reasons for keeping his distance, all his fears about power and responsibility, were burned away. He saw not a cook, not an employee, not a damsel in distress, but the other half of his own soul. The fire inside her that he had so admired was flickering, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could not let it go out. He tightened his grip on her, pulling her against his chest, his arms a circle of warmth and strength around her shaking shoulders. He pressed his face into her hair, which smelled of smoke and snow. "Then I'll break with you," he said, his voice thick and raw with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in a decade. The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than the roar of the fire. It wasn't a promise of protection. It wasn't a platitude to make her feel better. It was a vow, a declaration. It meant, your ruin is my ruin. Your fight is my fight. Where you go, I go. We are no longer two separate people struggling alone. We are one single entity, and we will face this devastation together. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and terrifying thing he had ever said. Eve heard the words, and they pierced through the fog of her despair. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw past the cold, authoritative rancher. She saw the man, his gray eyes stripped of their icy defenses, shining with a fierce, desperate love. It was a love that didn't seek to own or control, but to share in the very breaking of her soul. Her own control finally shattered. The tears came, hot and silent, carving clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. She didn't weep for what she had lost, but for what she had just found. She sagged against him, burying her face in the rough fabric of his coat, and her small, trembling hands came up to clutch at his arms. holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to ash. And so they knelt in the snow, two solitary figures illuminated by the dying embers of her past, clinging to each other. The men of Stone Valley watched in utter silence, their faces a mixture of awe and bewilderment. They were witnessing something far more profound than the destruction of a building. They were watching their boss, the master of Stone Valley, give his heart, his soul, his entire world over to the half-frozen girl in his arms. Eve Carter had lost her kitchen, but she had just conquered a kingdom. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 5, Secrets and Truths. Asterisk, asterisk. The world after the fire was a landscape of gray ash and white snow. The rising sun cast long, mournful shadows across the blackened footprint where the cookhouse had stood. A gaping wound in the heart of the ranch. The air was still thick with the ghost of smoke. For the men of Stone Valley, it was the dawn of a new and uncertain era. For Eve, it was the morning after the end of the world. Jesse had led her away from the smoldering ruins and into the main house, a place she had only ever seen from the outside. It was a masculine, formidable space, filled with dark wood, worn leather, and the heads of deer and elk mounted on the walls like stoic, glassy-eyed ghosts. He took her not to a spare room, but to his own study, the heart of his domain. He sat her down in a deep leather chair before a massive stone fireplace, where a new fire was already crackling, a tame and civilized cousin to the monster that had just consumed her life. He moved with a quiet, gentle purpose that was at odds with the raw power she'd seen him unleash. He cleaned the soot from her face with a damp cloth, his touch surprisingly soft. He tended to a small burn on her forearm, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eve submitted to his care in a state of shock, her mind a numb buzz, her body a collection of aches and a deep, soul-shaking chill. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled of him leather, wood smoke, and a faint, clean scent of the cold outdoors. It was an armor of impossible intimacy. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the amber liquid glowing in the firelight, and handed one to her. Her hands were still trembling, so he steadied them with his own. His hands were large and calloused, but they held hers with the care one might use to hold a shattered bird. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the pop and hiss of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. The shock was beginning to recede, and in its place, a vast, hollow emptiness opened up inside her. "It's all gone," she finally whispered, staring into the flames. "Timber and nails," Jesse said, his voice a low rumble. "I can replace timber and nails." He was trying to comfort her, she knew, but his words only highlighted the chasm between them. For him, the cookhouse was a possession, a replaceable asset. For her, it had been everything. He seemed to sense her thoughts. He put his glass down and turned in his chair to face her fully. The firelight carved deep shadows into the hard planes of his face, and his gray eyes were dark with a gravity she had never seen before. "Eve," he began, his voice quiet but intense. "Last night, what I said, I meant it, but for it to mean anything, you have to know who I am. All of it." She looked at him, confused. She knew who he was. He was Jesse Stone, the man who ran this valley, the man who had saved her life. "My name isn't just Jesse Stone," he said, his gaze unwavering. "This ranch isn't just my ranch. It belongs to my father, Samuel Stone. This valley, it's a fraction of what he owns. He's likely the wealthiest rancher in all of Montana Territory, with interests in railroads and mining from here to Virginia City." The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. Eve stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of what he was saying. The cold, authoritative boss she had known was not just a successful rancher. He was an heir, a prince in this rugged, unforgiving kingdom. The power she had sensed in him was not just that of a boss over his crew. It was the deep, unshakable power of immense, generational wealth. A cold, bitter anger began to uncoil in her gut, chasing away the numbness. It was the anger of betrayal. "You lied to me," she said, her voice flat. "I didn't lie," he countered, leaning forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I just didn't tell you the whole truth. There's a difference." "Is there?" she shot back, her voice rising with a sharp, wounded edge. "You let me believe you were just a man who worked for a living. Like me." "I am that man," he insisted, his own voice growing raw. "That's the man I came out here to be. I left my father's world in Philadelphia because it was a gilded cage, a world of business dinners and stock prices and expectations. He has a life planned for me. Eve, a career in his corporate offices, a seat on the board, a marriage to the daughter of his banker, a girl I've never met, a union designed to merge two fortunes." He stood up and began to pace before the fire, his large frame charged with a restless, frustrated energy. "I ran from that. I ran from a future that was already written for me, a life where I would be nothing more than Samuel Stone's son. I came here to build something with my own hands, to be measured by my own work. Playing the part of a simple ranch boss wasn't a game. It was the only way I knew how to be myself." His confession, meant to bridge the gap between them, only served to widen it into an impassable canyon. All Eve heard was the breathtaking privilege of his choices. He ran from a future of wealth and security. She had spent her entire life running toward the faintest glimmer of it. The anger inside her boiled over, hot and cleansing. She threw off the blanket and stood to face him, her small frame trembling with a righteous fury. "A gilded cage," she repeated, her voice dripping with a scorn she didn't try to hide. "You ran from a life of comfort and fortune to play the part of a working man. Do you have any idea what a mockery that is? While you were here finding yourself, I was walking through a blizzard, my shoes falling apart, not knowing if I would live to see the next morning, while you were worrying about a future that was too comfortable. I was fighting off whispers and accusations that could have seen me starve or worse. Your hardship was a choice. Mine was a matter of breathing in and out. You have never, not for 1 second, understood what it is to be truly alone and afraid. You, with all your land and your father's money, you don't know the first thing about what it takes to survive." She felt betrayed, his protection, his defense of her. The look in his eyes by the fire, it all felt like a lie now, the casual whim of a rich man playing with a stray he'd found in the snow. He had been watching her struggle, perhaps finding it novel, an interesting diversion. The intimacy she had felt was a sham. Jessie stopped pacing. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he had the grace to look ashamed. The truth of her accusation was undeniable. He had never known her kind of fear. "You're right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't, but what I felt for you, what I feel for you now, that was never a lie. That's the most real thing in my life." "How can it be?" she cried, her anger giving way to a deep, aching pain. "We are from two different worlds. You can't possibly see me as anything but a charity case, a broken thing you fixed." She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be his pet project, his good deed. The power imbalance was too vast, too humiliating. She had to leave. It was the only way to reclaim the shattered pieces of her pride. "I'll get my things," she said, her voice hollow, and turned toward the door. "Eve, wait," he pleaded. But she didn't stop. She walked out of the study, out of the main house, and back into the cold morning light, her path leading to the bunkhouse where she'd been given a temporary room. Her only thought was of flight. Denver, the road, anywhere but here. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The mail rider, delayed 2 days by the storm, arrived mid-morning. An old cowboy named Silas, whose gruffness Eve had learned was a cover for a decent heart, found her in the small room she'd been given, packing the few meager possessions she had left: a spare dress, a comb, and the ruined, heartbreaking husk of her mother's cookbook. "Got a letter for you, miss," Silas said, holding out a crumpled, travel-stained envelope. Been sitting at the post office in Clearwater Gap for a week, I reckon. Eve took it, her brow furrowed. No one wrote to her. No one even knew she was here. The letter was addressed simply to Evelyn Carter, Stone Valley Ranch. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a careful, looping script. She sat on the edge of the cot and carefully broke the seal. The letter was short. Asterisk, Dear Evelyn. Asterisk, I do not know if you will remember me. My name is Sarah. Our mother, before she passed, spoke of you. She said you had gone to Billings to make your way. I am her daughter from her second husband, your sister. Asterisk, I am living in Denver now. I work as a seamstress and have a small room of my own above the shop. Mother told me you were alone in the world, as I am. I do not know your circumstances, but I wanted you to know that you are not entirely without family. If you ever find yourself in need of a place to go, you have a sister in Denver who would be glad to see you. Asterisk, yours, Sarah. Eve read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, her vision blurring. A sister. She had a sister. The words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. All her life, she had been a solitary reed, bent by the wind, with no roots to hold her fast. But this letter, this was a root, a fragile, tentative connection to a family she thought had vanished from the earth. Denver. The name was no longer a vague direction on a map. It was a destination. It was a person. It was hope. The choice, which had seemed so agonizingly impossible moments before, suddenly became clear. She could not stay here, in this world of suffocating wealth and lies, where she would always be the poor girl Jessie Stone had saved. But she no longer had to simply run asterisk from asterisk Stone Valley. She could run asterisk to asterisk someone. She was folding the letter, her decision made, when Jesse appeared in the open doorway. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale beneath its weathered tan. He didn't enter the room, but stood on the threshold, giving her space. He had seen the mail rider. He had seen Silas deliver the letter. He saw the new, resolute light in her eyes, and his heart sank. He was losing her. I came to make you an offer, he said, his voice quiet and formal. All the raw emotion from their earlier confrontation carefully locked away. I know I have no right to ask you to stay. After what you said, I understand if you feel you can't be here. He took a deep breath. The men are already clearing the site of the cookhouse. I'm sending a wire to Helena for lumber and supplies. I'm going to rebuild it. Bigger, better, with a proper pantry and a new stove. It will be yours, Eve, to run as you see fit. You would not be my cook. You would be the manager of the entire commissary. Your own boss. He paused, letting the offer settle. Then he gave her the alternative. Or, I will pay you a year's wages for the work you've done. More than enough to buy a ticket to anywhere you want to go. San Francisco, St. Louis, anywhere. You could start over, with a real stake. The choice is yours. Completely yours. You will not leave this ranch because you are forced to. If you go, it will be because you have chosen to. He stood there, waiting, his gray eyes holding hers. He had offered her everything. He had offered her a kingdom to command, or the means to escape him entirely. He had lied to her about who he was. But in this, he was offering her the one thing she had never had a true choice. He was giving her back her own life. Eve looked down at the precious letter in her hand, then up at the powerful, heartbroken man in the doorway. One represented a past she never knew and a future she could barely imagine. The other represented a present that was both a lie and the most profound truth she had ever known. For the first time, she had more than one road to choose from, and she had no idea which one to take. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6. Shadow and light asterisk E asterisk. Eve did not make a choice. For days, she existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the edges of the ranch's bustling life. Jesse's offer hung in the air between them, a question too heavy to answer. She held both of her possible futures in her hands, a letter promising a sister and a new life in Denver, and the silent, powerful presence of a man who was rebuilding her world, piece by piece, hoping she would choose to live in it. The ranch itself was a hive of activity. A massive wagon, loaded with fresh-milled pine from Helena, had arrived, and the air was filled with the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and the rhythmic percussion of hammers. A new foundation was laid where the old cookhouse had stood, and, under Jesse's watchful eye, the skeleton of a new building began to rise from the ashes. The men worked with a grim, focused energy, their guilt over their past treatment of Eve manifesting as a desire to build her a fortress. She spent her time in a small, unused parlor in the main house that Jesse had quietly designated as hers. It was a concession to propriety, a space that was neither the boss's study nor a servant's quarters, but something in between. From its window, she could see the construction. She watched the walls go up, a tangible representation of Jesse's promise and a terrible, tempting vision of a future she was too afraid to claim. Her days were spent in a quiet battle with herself. The instinct to run, honed by a lifetime of hardship, was a powerful current pulling her toward Denver. It was the safe choice, the known path. To flee, to start over where no one knew her, was the only survival strategy she had ever known. Sarah's letter was a passport to that life, a promise that this time she wouldn't be running into emptiness, but toward a family. But then there was Jesse. He kept his distance, respecting the fragile space she needed. Yet his presence was a constant, gravitational force. She would look up and find him watching her from across the yard, his gray eyes full of a quiet, aching question. He did not pressure her, did not plead. He simply worked, his hands raw from the labor, building a future and hoping she would be in it. And she remembered his words. Spoken in the firelight, then I'll break with you. It was a vow that had woven itself into the fabric of her soul, and the thought of severing it felt like tearing herself in two. Her most prized and painful possession was the charred remnant of her mother's cookbook. She would spend hours at the small parlor table, painstakingly separating the few pages that had survived. Most were brittle, the ink blurred beyond recognition, but she managed to salvage a small handful from the center of the book. The recipe for her mother's sourdough starter, the instructions for a slow-cooked venison stew, a simple recipe for apple slump. They were more than just instructions. They were seeds, scraps of a legacy she thought had been utterly destroyed. She would trace the faded script with her finger, the words a tangible link to a past she barely remembered, and wonder if she had the courage to plant these seeds here, in this violent, uncertain soil. The shadow fell upon Stone Valley on a cold, clear afternoon a week after the fire. It arrived not as a storm cloud, but in a polished black carriage drawn by two perfectly matched gray horses, a vehicle so out of place in the rugged landscape, it looked as if it had driven straight out of a different world. A man stepped out, tall and impeccably dressed in a fine wool suit and a bowler hat. He was older, his hair a distinguished silver at the temples, his face a mask of shrewd intelligence and absolute, unshakable authority. He carried a silver-headed cane, though he did not lean on it. He held it as a king might hold a scepter. Jesse was at the construction site, hammering a crossbeam into place, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal his powerful forearms. He froze when he saw the carriage, his face paling beneath its tan. The hammer slipped from his hand and fell to the ground with a dull thud. Eve, watching from the window, felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. She did not need to be told who this man was. He had Jesse's height, his commanding presence, and the same hard, assessing eyes, though this man's were a cold, piercing blue. This was Samuel Stone. The king had come to inspect his distant province. The reunion between father and son was a formal, chillingly polite affair conducted on the porch of the main house. There were no embraces, only a firm handshake and a clipped exchange of words. Then Samuel Stone's gaze swept across the ranch. taking in the construction, his eyes finally landing on the parlor window where Eve stood, a silent, unwilling observer. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable but deeply unsettling, before turning back to his son and gesturing toward the study. The door closed behind them, and the battle began. Inside the study, Samuel did not waste time with pleasantries. He stood before the fireplace, tapping his cane against the hearthstone. "A fire," he said, his voice the smooth, cold click of a bank vault's lock, an unfortunate expense, but easily rectified. What is less easily rectified is the reason I am here. Jesse, I received a letter from my associate, Mr. Abernathy, the banker. His daughter, Elizabeth, is expecting a proposal. Our families are expecting a merger. And I find you out here, playing cowboy and, according to my sources in Clearwater Gap, getting yourself entangled with some scruffy kitchen girl." Jesse stood his ground on the other side of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. "Her name is Evelyn, and she is not an entanglement." Oh, Samuel's eyebrow arched. "Then what, precisely? Is she I arrived to find you've had a brawl over her honor like some cheap saloon ruffian, and now you are erecting a new building for her at considerable expense? It seems like a rather significant entanglement to me. This little frontier fantasy of yours has gone on long enough. It's time to come home, take your place in the company, and fulfill your obligations." "My obligation is here," Jesse said, his voice low and tight, and to her, Samuel laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't be a fool. You feel a sense of responsibility for the girl, I'm sure. Pay her off, give her a generous sum, and send her on her way. She'll be happier for it in the long run. Women of her station understand such arrangements." A muscle worked in Jesse's jaw. "She is not for sale, and she is not a station. She is a woman I intend to marry." The words, spoken for the first time, hung in the air, shocking them both. The cane stopped its tapping. Samuel Stone turned slowly to face his son, his blue eyes narrowed to icy slits. "You will do no such thing," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You are a stone. Your name carries the weight of a dynasty. You will not throw it away on some nameless, penniless stray you picked up out of the snow. I forbid it." "I am 32 years old," Jesse countered, his own voice rising to match his father's intensity. "You may forbid me from my inheritance, but you will not forbid me from my life. I have been running from your plans and your world since the day I left Philadelphia. I thought I was running to be free, but I was just running. With her. For the first time, I feel like I have something to stand my ground for, something to build, not just manage. She is not a complication in my life. Father, she is the point of it." The argument raged for an hour, a clash of two worlds, two generations, two definitions of a man's worth. Eve, in her parlor, could hear the muffled sound of their raised voices, and each angry syllable felt like a blow. She was the eye of the hurricane, the unnamed disaster that had brought this storm down upon the house. All her deepest fears were being realized. She was a problem, a liability, an obstacle to be removed. Samuel Stone's presence was a brutal confirmation that she did not and could not ever belong in Jesse's world. Her hand went to the letter in her pocket. Denver, Sarah, a world where she would not be a scandal, but a sister. The choice was no longer a choice. It was an inevitability. The study door opened, and Samuel Stone strode out, his face a thundercloud. He saw her standing in the parlor doorway and stopped. He looked her up and down, his gaze a deliberate and calculated insult. "So you are the girl," he said. "I will say this only once. My son is in the grip of a temporary, and most unfortunate, delusion. But he is a stone. He will come to his senses. Do not imagine for one moment that you have any future in this family. Take whatever money he offers you, and disappear. It is the most sensible thing for everyone." He turned and walked out of the house without another word. leaving Eve feeling as though she had been flayed. But Samuel Stone did not leave the ranch. Over the next 2 days, he remained, a silent, judging presence. He toured the property, inspected the cattle, and spoke with the foreman, his mind assessing his son's work, calculating profits and losses, and he watched. He watched Eve. He expected to see her moping in the house, or perhaps trying to curry favor with his son. Instead, he saw her walk out to the construction site. She didn't speak to Jesse. She stood to the side, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and simply observed. After a while, he saw her approach the foreman, a man named Pete, and point to the plans laid out on a makeshift table. He saw her speak, her expression earnest, her hands gesturing to describe a space. He saw the foreman nod, then call Jesse over. The three of them stood in a huddle, and Samuel watched as his son listened intently to the girl, a look of profound respect on his face, before nodding and giving new instructions to the carpenters. Later, from his window, Samuel saw Jesse approach her as she stood by the corral. He couldn't hear their words, but he saw the way Jesse stood, not crowding her, but simply being near her. He saw the quiet strength in the girl's posture, the way she met his son's gaze directly. He saw no tears, no hysterics, no feminine wiles. He saw a resilience that was as hard and unyielding as the Montana landscape itself. He saw a woman who was not looking for a rescue, but for a foundation on which to build. That evening, Samuel found his son in the study once more. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a weary pragmatism. "That girl," he began, without preamble. "The cook, she has a spine of iron." Jesse looked up from his desk, surprised. "Yes," he said simply, "she does. I saw her at the building site," Samuel continued, almost thinking aloud. She was redesigning the pantry, arguing with Pete about the placement of the stove for better workflow. "She understands work. She understands value." He paused, looking into the fire. "She is not at all what I expected." He turned to Jesse, his expression one of grudging acceptance. "I do not approve of this. The Abernathy alliance is a significant loss. But I raised you to be a stone, and the one thing a stone does not do is break his word." He picked up his cane. "You made her a promise in that fire. I will not be the one to make you go back on it. The folly is yours. Jesse, see that you make it a success." It was not a blessing, but it was a retreat. It was an acknowledgement that Jesse was no longer a boy to be commanded, but a man who had chosen his own ground. Later, Jesse found Eve by the smoldering remains of the fire pit where the debris from the cookhouse had been burned. The moon was high and cold, casting the new frame of the building in a skeletal, hopeful light. She had made her decision. The terror was still there, a cold flutter in her stomach, but for the first time, it was outweighed by something else, a fierce, stubborn desire to stay, to fight, to build. She held up the charred pages of the cookbook. "There's not much left," she said, her voice quiet, "but there's a recipe for sourdough starter, and for venison stew. It's a start." He understood. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a declaration of intent. She was choosing to plant her seeds here. "Is it enough?" he asked, his voice raw. She looked from the charred pages in her hand to the new building rising against the night sky. She thought of the long, lonely road to Denver, and of the sister she hoped to one day meet. Then she looked at the man standing before her, the man who had been willing to break with her. "Yes," she said, and the word was a promise, both to him and to herself. "This time, I'm not running. This time, I'm building." Asterisk, asterisk, Part 7. Choosing to stay. Asterisk, asterisk. The word yes, spoken into the cold Montana night, was the quietest and most revolutionary act of Evelyn Carter's life. It was not a surrender to Jesse, nor was it a mere acceptance of his offer. It was a declaration of war on the person she used to be, the girl who ran, The girl who hid. The girl who survived on scraps of hope and hardened pride. That girl had died somewhere between the fire and the dawn. In her place stood a woman who was choosing, for the first time, not just to live, but how to live. In the days that followed, the change in her was palpable. The haunted, wary look in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. The hesitant way she moved through the main house gave way to a stride of quiet purpose. She was no longer a guest or a refugee. She was a planner, an architect of her own future. The fear had not vanished entirely. It was a low, familiar hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, a ghost whispering of all that could still go wrong, but it no longer held the reins. It had been relegated to the passenger seat. Her transformation was most evident at the construction site. She shed her role as a passive observer and became an active participant, armed with a piece of charcoal and a clean pine board. She would spend hours with Pete, the grizzled, long-suffering foreman, sketching and resketching the layout of her new domain. "No, Pete, the main stove has to be central," she'd insist, her voice calm but firm, pointing with the charcoal stick. "It's the heart. Everything flows around it. We need a separate baking oven here, against the north wall, where the temperature will be more stable. And the pantry, it needs to be twice as large, with deep shelves and a root cellar beneath for the winter stock." Pete, a man accustomed to taking orders only from Jessie, found himself nodding in agreement. The girl made sense. She spoke of workflow and efficiency, of seasonal storage and the practicalities of feeding 30 men in a blizzard, with a knowledge that was both innate and hard-won. He saw in her not the boss's woman, but a professional who knew her craft as well as he knew his. Jessie, for his part, stepped back. He had set the wheels in motion, provided the raw materials, but he understood instinctively that this next part of the process did not belong to him. This was Eve's creation. To interfere would be to diminish her, to reduce her to a beneficiary of his wealth. He had spent his life running from a future built for him by his father. He would not, in turn, build one for her. They would have to build it together. So he became her partner, not her benefactor. When Pete came to him with a question about a structural change Eve had requested, Jessie would simply say, "Ask Miss Carter. It's her kitchen." The title was a quiet but significant shift to the men, who now watched her with a mixture of awe and respect. She was no longer the cook or the girl. She was Miss Carter. His love for her deepened, evolving from a protective, passionate fire into a steady, profound admiration. He had fallen for the survivor, the fierce spirit who had defied him in the firelight. But he was now watching that spirit blossom into something more, a leader, a creator. He saw her strength not as something to be shielded, but as something to stand beside. In choosing her over his father's dynasty, he had feared he was throwing away his future. He now realized he had been trading a life of gilded emptiness for one of genuine, shared purpose. In freeing her to choose her own path, he had finally unshackled himself from the one he'd been running from. He was no longer Samuel Stone's rebellious son playing cowboy. He was Jesse Stone, a man building a home with the woman he loved. Samuel Stone observed all of this from the cold, strategic distance of the main house's porch he had stayed on, a silent, brooding eagle surveying his territory. He had lost the initial battle with his son, but he had not yet conceded the war. He watched Eve, his shrewd eyes missing nothing her confidence with the foreman, the respect she commanded from the crew, the way his son looked at her, as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning universe. He had come to Montana to retrieve his errant son and put an end to a foolish infatuation. He had expected to find a conniving, ambitious girl using her feminine charms to trap a wealthy heir. He was a man who understood transactions, who believed every person had a price. He had been prepared to meet Eve's price and be done with it, but Evelyn Carter defied all his calculations. She did not flatter Jessie. She did not seek Samuel out to plead her case. She did not act like a woman who had won a great prize. She acted like a woman who had work to do. On his final day at the ranch, Samuel summoned them both, not to the study, the seat of power and conflict, but to the construction site itself. He stood amidst the scent of sawdust and the half-finished frames of the new building, his polished city shoes looking absurd on the muddy, trampled ground. He held his silver-headed cane, not as a weapon, but as a pointer. Jesse and Eve stood before him, a united front. Jesse's arm was not around her, but he stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched, a silent statement of solidarity. Samuel's cold blue eyes rested on Eve. He did not smile, but the open contempt was gone, replaced by a look of grudging, analytical respect. "Miss Carter," he began, the formal address a clear signal of a shift in tactics. "My son informs me that you have a talent for management. I have a talent for running a kitchen." "Mr. Stone," Eve corrected him quietly, her gaze direct and unflinching. She would not be patronized. A flicker of something perhaps amusement crossed Samuel's stern features. "Indeed, a kitchen that is rapidly expanding in scope and expense." He gestured with his cane toward the growing structure. "This is to be no mere bunkhouse cook shack. This is an institution. An institution requires proper leadership." He let the words hang in the air, his gaze pinning her. Jesse tensed, sensing a trap, a final attempt to drive a wedge between them. "Jesse has made his choice," Samuel continued, his eyes still locked on Eve. "He has chosen this life, and he has chosen you. A choice I consider to be financial folly and a dynastic disaster. However, I am, above all, a businessman. I do not invest in failing enterprises." He took a step closer to her, his presence immense. "I have watched you this past week. You are not a cook. You are an asset. You understand logistics, supply, and morale. You have a spine of iron and, I suspect, a mind for numbers. These are qualities I respect." He turned to Jesse, then back to Eve, making it clear his next words were a decree that superseded any of his son's promises. "Therefore, the situation is no longer a matter of my son's personal charity. As of this moment, this building and the entire commissary of the Stone Valley Ranch and all its holdings are under your authority. You are no longer an employee. You are its manager. You will be responsible for all provisions, all staff, and all budgets for the bunkhouse, the outlying camps, and," he paused for effect, "the main house, my house, The silence that followed was broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. Eve stared at him, stunned into immobility. This was not an offer. It was a coronation. He wasn't just giving her back her kitchen. He was giving her the keys to the entire domestic kingdom. It was a position of immense trust and staggering responsibility. It was a test, she knew, a challenge of a different kind. He was daring her to succeed on a scale she had never imagined. Jesse was equally shocked. He looked at his father, and for the first time, he understood. This was not a surrender. It was a strategic maneuver. By giving Eve this formal, powerful position, his father was attempting to absorb her into his world, to transform her from a romantic folly into a quantifiable asset on the Stone family ledger. It was his way of controlling a situation he could not prevent. But it was also, Jesse realized with a jolt, an incredible, almost unbelievable vote of confidence. Samuel Stone looked at Eve, waiting for her response. He expected her to be flustered, to stammer her thanks, to be overwhelmed by his generosity. Eve took a deep breath, the cold air steadying her. She met the old man's gaze, not as a girl accepting a gift, but as a professional accepting a post. The scared, running orphan was gone forever, and in her place stood the manager of the Stone Valley Commissary. "I accept the position. Mr. Stone," she said, her voice clear and even. "You will receive a full accounting of all expenditures on the 1st of every month. I will not disappoint you." She did not thank him. She did not gush. She met his business proposition with businesslike acceptance. For the first time, Samuel Stone's stern facade cracked. A genuine, if small, smile touched his lips. He had thrown down a gauntlet, and she had not only picked it up, she had thrown it right back. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture. "Very good. Miss Carter." He turned to his son. "See that you don't get in her way." And with that, he turned and walked back toward the waiting carriage. His part in the drama finished. He had not given his blessing, but he had given something far more valuable in his world. He had given his sanction. He had legitimized her. When he was gone, Eve and Jesse stood alone amidst the rising timber frames of their future. Jesse turned to her, his gray eyes shining with a love so fierce and proud it took her breath away. "The manager of the Stone Valley Commissary," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It has a nice ring to it." Eve looked at the structure around her, not just a kitchen, but her office, her domain. She looked at the man beside her, not just her protector, but her partner. The ghosts of her past were still there, but they were silent now, their power broken. She was no longer running from them. She was home. "Yes," she agreed, a real smile, the first one he had ever truly seen, lighting up her face. "I think it does." ***, Part 8. The New Kitchen. The New Love ***. Spring came to the high plains of Montana not as a gentle thaw, but as a fierce, muddy, life-affirming battle against the dominion of winter. The snow receded in dirty patches, revealing the pale, sleeping grass beneath. The creeks, choked with ice for months, broke free with a roar, and the air, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, carried not the promise of frost, but the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. And at the heart of Stone Valley Ranch, a new beginning had already taken root. The new cookhouse, or as it was now formally known, the commissary, was a monument to resilience. It stood on the ashes of the old, but it was not its ghost. It was a resurrection. Built of sturdy, light-colored pine, it was twice the size of the original, with a high, vaulted ceiling and a row of large glass windows along its southern wall that flooded the space with a natural light. The long trestle tables were new and smooth, the floorboards level and clean. It was a space that spoke not of grim survival, but of a thriving, prosperous future. The heart of the building was the kitchen, and the heart of the kitchen was the magnificent new stove. It was a behemoth of polished iron and gleaming steel, a top-of-the-line Monarch model shipped by wagon all the way from St. Louis, with 6 burners, a warming oven, and a capacious baking chamber. It was a queen on its throne, and Evelyn Carter was its undisputed sovereign. In the months since Samuel Stone's departure, Eve had come into her own. The title of a manager was not a hollow one. She commanded her domain with a quiet authority that was more effective than any shouted order. She oversaw a larder stocked with a precision born of a lifetime of fearing scarcity. She planned menus that were both hearty and varied, banishing the monotony of beans and salt pork that had defined the cowboy diet for generations. She hired 2 young women from Clearwater Gap to help her, giving them not just a wage, but her protection and respect, creating a small island of female solidarity in a sea of men. The men of Stone Valley, in turn, revered her. They had witnessed her trial by fire, both literally and figuratively. They had seen her stand up to Red Callahan, face down the formidable Samuel Stone, and rise from the ashes of her own ruin. The sly whispers and crude jokes were a distant, shameful memory. Now, they tipped their hats as she passed. They addressed her as Miss Carter. They brought her small offerings, a string of trout from the newly thawed creek, a handful of early wild berries, like subjects paying tribute to a fair and just queen. They were no longer just being fed. They were being cared for, and under her quiet, steady influence, the rough, brutal edge of their existence began to soften. The cookhouse became more than a place to eat. It became the ranch's living room, a place of warmth, light, and community. Eve had changed. The thin, haunted girl who had stumbled out of the snow was a ghost. The woman who now stood in the center of her gleaming kitchen was someone new. Her face had filled out, the harsh lines of hunger and fear replaced by the soft curves of peace and purpose. There was a confidence in her bearing, a clarity in her green eyes. She had found something she never knew she was looking for, not just a place to survive, but a place to belong. Her relationship with Jesse had settled into a rhythm of quiet, profound partnership. There was no grand, public courtship. Their love was not built on stolen glances and whispered sweet nothings, but on the shared weight of 100 small, everyday decisions. It was in the way he would stop by the kitchen at the end of a long day, not to check on her work, but simply to stand in her presence for a moment, breathing in the warm, food-scented air of the world she had created. It was in the way she would set aside a plate for him, knowing he'd be working late on the ledgers. A silent act of care that spoke volumes more than any declaration. He had never once interfered with her running of the commissary. He had given her his complete trust, and in doing so, had given her the space to become the woman she was meant to be. He was her partner, her staunchest ally, the silent, steady bedrock upon which she was building her new life. They were two halves of a whole, each drawing strength from the other. One quiet evening, as the last of the spring sun painted the mountains in hues of rose and gold, Eve sat at a small desk in the corner of her new office, a small room she had designed for herself off the main kitchen. The day's work was done. The kitchen was clean and silent, the new stove radiating a gentle, sleepy warmth. Through the window, she could see Jesse walking across the yard, his long shadow stretching out behind him. He was heading for the house. He would be waiting for her. On the desk before her lay two things. One was a clean sheet of foolscap and a pen. The other was the worn, stained letter from Denver. She had read it so many times the creases were soft as cloth. For months, it had represented an escape, a lifeline to a different future. Now, it represented something else, a connection to be forged, a family to be built, not run to. She dipped the pen in the inkwell. Her handwriting, once the hurried scrawl of a girl on the run, was now steady and clear. Asterisk, my dearest Sarah. Asterisk, you wrote to me in the winter, and I cannot tell you what your letter meant to me. It arrived at a time when I believed I was utterly alone in the world. To know I had a sister was a light in a very dark time. I hope you can forgive my long delay in answering. My life has changed in ways I never could have imagined. Asterisk, I am no longer in Billings. I am at a place called the Stone Valley Ranch in Montana. I came here seeking work, and I have found much more. I am the manager of the commissary here. I have a home. Sarah, a real one. For the first time in my life, I am not running from my past, but building a future. Asterisk, the reason I write is to say that the invitation you so kindly offered to me, I now wish to offer to you. I know nothing of your life in Denver, but you spoke of being alone. You are not. You have a sister here. There is work. If you need it, there is a room. There is a place for you. This valley is vast, and the winters are hard, but the people are good, and there is a great peace to be found in these mountains. Asterisk, you do not need to answer right away, but please know, the door at Stone Valley is always open to you. For the first time, I have a home to share, and I would like nothing more than to share it with my sister. Asterisk, your loving sister. Asterisk, Evelyn. Asterisk. She was signing her name when a shadow fell across the page. Jesse was standing in the doorway, his presence filling the small space. He was not smiling, but his eyes, the color of a calm evening sky, were full of a deep and abiding love. He didn't ask what she was writing. He didn't need to. He simply came and stood behind her chair, his large, warm hand coming to rest on her shoulder. Eve leaned back against him, the solid strength of his presence a comforting anchor. He had seen her at her most broken, at her most terrified. He had seen her fury and her despair, and he had not run. He had stayed. He had offered to break with her, and in doing so, had made them both whole. She looked at the letter, then out the window at the ranch settling into the twilight. This was her world. This was her life, a life she had chosen, a life she had built. A single happy tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. "This time," she whispered, so quietly it was almost a thought. "I'll stay." Jesse's hand tightened on her shoulder, his thumb gently stroking her collarbone. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her hair, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. "Forever," he answered, "with you." Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts with our community. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story be heard by more folks, please support us by hitting that hype button. Your support means the world to us.